been really bored, and I've watched way too much Netflix and stuff, so I decided to do this instead because it's a little bit more fulfilling than watching season 6 of Lost for like the 5th time. Welcome to episode 1 of History is Whack. Episode 1 topic is the 6 wives of King Henry VIII. King Henry VIII of England is whack. He had 6 wives, and one after the other, and that's pretty interesting, the story of what happened to all of them. He changed all of England to Protestant, to Anglican, the Church of England, and the reason behind that is really interesting. It has to do with his wives. So first of all, Henry was never supposed to be the king because he was the second son. His older brother was Prince Arthur. Arthur got set up with a princess from Spain called Catherine of Aragon. And I love Catherine of Aragon. She's my favorite of his 6 wives. She comes to England, and it's a big deal. She comes and marries Arthur, but they're only married for like a couple of months when Arthur dies. He's sick, so he dies. It's kind of scary for Catherine because she doesn't know what the heck is going to happen to her. So she's kind of in limbo for a while in England and trying to figure out what's going to happen. And they ultimately decide to marry her again to Henry, Prince Henry, who is much younger than her and still like a kid at this time. He's like 14 or something, so she has to like wait a while. And in order to actually marry him, they have to get special permission from the Pope, because basically once you marry someone, their siblings are seen as like your siblings in the eyes of the church. So you're not supposed to marry your sibling. So to marry Henry, the church was like, no, that's like your brother now. You can't do that, Catherine. So they got special permission from the Pope. They do get married. They become king and queen. Time goes by, and the only child that Catherine is able to produce is a girl, and her name is Mary. Catherine is a very devout Catholic woman. She does not even consider the idea of divorce, despite the fact that Henry has lots of affairs with other women and stuff. She stays with him, and then eventually he gets so annoyed with her that he's really thinking like, what can I do to like get rid of this chick? And he has a relationship first with Mary Boleyn. Maybe he had some kids with her, not really sure, but then casts her aside in favor of her sister, Anne Boleyn. So have you ever heard of those books, or that book called The Other Boleyn Girl, or whatever it's called? That's about Mary and Anne Boleyn. So instead, Henry becomes obsessed with Anne Boleyn, and he really, really wants to be with her, and she is basically like, marry me and make me the Queen of England. So she's like smart, but like not smart. We'll talk about that later. So Henry's like, oh, I gotta get rid of Catherine, but she doesn't want to get a divorce. What am I supposed to do? The Catholic Church isn't going to let it happen for him. The Pope is on Catherine's side. The Pope is like, I gave you special permission like 22 years ago or something to marry this chick, and now you want to get rid of her for somebody else? You can't do that. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Protestant Reformation has begun. Henry decides to basically convert England to Protestantism so that he can be the leader of a new sect of Protestantism called the Church of England, or Anglican. He's really not doing it for religious purposes. He's doing it because he wants to get rid of his wife. And he does. So he creates his religion. I'm the leader of the religion. Goodbye, Catherine. Divorced. Catherine is basically sent to live in a house in the countryside. Anyway, so now, as soon as Catherine is gone, and it's totally legal for him to do so, Henry marries his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn is by far the most famous of his 6 wives, and you're about to find out why. Henry's like, okay, have a son. All that matters to Henry is having a son. He needs to have an heir, and if you're not able to provide him with a son, then he doesn't really like you anymore. So that's why Catherine went bye-bye. With Anne, she has some miscarriages. And he gets really mad because she promised him so much. I'll give you sons, don't worry, blah, 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 blah. But she's actually kind of getting old at this point. She's like in her 30s. That's like middle-aged. So like the time for when she's able to have a baby is getting like smaller and smaller and smaller. She finally has a baby. It's a girl. The girl is named Elizabeth. She has bright red hair. You may know who I'm talking about. Henry kind of like loves his kids, but they're girls, so we also kind of hate them. It's like a whole thing. By now, Catherine of Aragon has died in poverty without being allowed to see her daughter Mary, which is really messed up. He's mad at Anne. He's like, you made me all these promises, and then you broke them. I think he like grows to like hate her. I don't know. This guy's got like no heart. So Henry like rallies up his people and is like, what can we do to get rid of this chick? He's like to his people, do what you gotta do to get rid of her. I don't care. And his people are like, well, we can like charge her with a bunch of fake stuff and she can die. And he's like, okay, just do it. They make up all these things to say that she was a witch, that she cast spells on Henry. They also said that she was an adulterer. There is no historical evidence whatsoever to support that Anne Boleyn had affairs with other men. But she was accused of being an adulteress with some of her friends at court, and perhaps most notably her own brother, George. And there was no evidence for that whatsoever. All of those men are killed. I believe they're hanged. But because she is the queen, she gets special treatment when it comes to like being killed, I guess. So she gets her head chopped off. So Anne Boleyn dies, and literally like a couple weeks after she's dead, Henry marries his third wife already. Her name is Jane Seymour. And Jane Seymour is my least favorite of Henry's wives. Like literally Anne Boleyn got her head chopped off, her head rolled away, and Jane walks right by it pretty much. She, like Anne Boleyn, comes with her family. You know, she's got her two brothers. She promises Henry, don't worry, my husband. I'll do everything you say. I promise I'll have a son. So then she gets pregnant, and she actually does have a son. She has a boy, and they name him Edward. And immediately Henry is so happy. He's like, Jane is the best wife ever. She's my favorite wife. You know, back in the 1500s, there were a lot of problems when women gave birth, like infections and stuff. So she got sick and she died from childbirth. And Henry actually like plunged into a state of like depression because he said that, you know, she was his real wife. The other two didn't even like count. So he's like really upset for like, I think like a couple of years, but he does have a son now. He has Edward. So he like dotes on the son. And even though Jane's dead, her brothers still remain really important. Her brothers are Edward and Thomas Seymour. Eventually, his advisors are like, Henry, you should get married again. They said this time, do it for political purposes. Why don't we look at like Germany? An important unmarried daughter in Germany, and that is Anne of Cleves. Advisors ever go to Germany, and they meet her, but Henry does not. They paint like a picture of her for Henry, and he's like, oh, she's beautiful, I'll marry her, bring her to England, let's get married. So they don't really meet each other until they get married, and he hates her face. He literally calls Anne of Cleves the Flanders mare. And if you don't know mare, M-A-R-E, it's like horse, okay? So he calls her like horse face, which is horrible. And actually, if you look at the portraits of his 6 wives, I mean, they're probably not accurate, but the one with the best portrait is actually Anne of Cleves, in my opinion. So it's kind of funny that he was like, she's ugly. And so they were only married for like a couple months, and he's like, I want an annulment. Let's like pretend this never happened. And she does perhaps the smartest thing that any of his wives do in relation to him, and that's she agrees to it. Like, yeah, totes, let's split up. Totally fine by me. I'm not gonna fight you on this, like Catherine or Anne did. Like, it's all good. I'm not interested in you either. She doesn't fight him at all. She just kind of goes along with it. So they annul their marriage, and he decides to give her lots of like money and servants and like a big countryside, like royal manor to live in England. And she actually never goes back to Germany. She stays in England for the rest of her life. He considers her to be like his friend, or like sister. When she's gone, Henry's back to who will give me babies. And so, you know, Catherine, she became too old and couldn't give him kids. Anne was too old and couldn't give him kids. So he's like, I need to marry somebody real young. And this is where it gets super creepy. He marries a girl who's basically 17 years old. Her name is Catherine Howard, and she's actually a cousin of Anne Boleyn. She's literally 17 years old, and she can't read. She's very uneducated. They get married, but he's like 40-something at this point. She's 17. So he thinks they're in this great relationship, and he's like, she'll have a kid any day now because she's real young. But there's actually evidence to support this. It comes out that she was probably having an affair with Thomas Culpeper, who is her cousin too, which is creepy. But back then they didn't care about that because I think he was like in his 20s or something. He was older than her, but was still a relatively young guy. They get caught. And Thomas Culpeper is killed, of course. And now Catherine Howard is going to be killed as well. And then Catherine Howard gets her head chopped off. So by this point, Henry has one son, Edward, two daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. Mary is the oldest of his kids. And he's had 5 wives already. 4 of them are dead. The only one who's alive is Anne of Cleves, his sister friend. He's got a bad reputation. And women in England are like, no, I don't want to be queen, no thanks. So Henry meets this woman named Catherine Parr. She's a little bit older. At this point, he's like, I just need somebody to be my nurse and take care of me because he's like getting real old and has like all these problems like ulcers and stuff. He's kind of lost hope for having more kids. And he sees Catherine Parr and is like, this lady, she's smart, she's beautiful, and she's sweet. I want her. Catherine Parr does not want Henry. Not even like remotely. Not interested. Catherine was in love with Thomas Seymour. So you may remember Jane Seymour, Henry's 3rd wife who actually had a son. One of her brothers is Thomas. So Catherine Parr loves Thomas Seymour, and Henry's like, no, goodbye, Thomas Seymour. He basically gives Catherine no choice, and he marries Catherine, and she becomes the 6th and final of his queens. And so she has to like take care of him and stuff. She is the most educated of all of his wives. She actually like wrote books and stuff. She's really cool. And she's also very Protestant. You may be wondering, oh gosh, what horrible thing does he do to her? Well, before he has any chance to do any sort of horrible thing to her, he dies. And so she survives. So if you've ever heard that rhyme about Henry VIII's wives, it says them in order. And it says, divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. She's the survived one. However, her story doesn't end well either. When Henry dies, his son Edward becomes king. Edward is still a boy at this point. He's still a kid. He's not old enough to be like the legit king. So he has like a lord protector who basically runs the country. Like 6 months after Henry dies, Catherine Parr remarries to Thomas Seymour, the guy that she loved before Henry forced her to marry him. And they have a baby. However, Thomas Seymour was a really, really bad guy. And like she just, I don't know if she was blinded by love or what. She never realized this. But he was a pedophile. And he actually like tried to get with Princess Elizabeth, who was like 13 years old. And he's like a grown man. So that's really gross. After giving birth to her baby, Catherine Parr dies. And her baby sort of fades into history. So we believe that the baby eventually dies as well. Edward, who is now king, is a very sickly dude, and he eventually dies from illness. There's like a war, basically, over what should happen now. And on one side is Mary, who is very much an adult princess, and very, very Catholic, like her mother, Catherine. And she wants to be the queen. And on the other side, there are all the people who really don't want a Catholic queen. They need a Protestant. So they pick from like obscurity a distantly related girl, and they're like, you're going to be the queen. And they go to war, and that girl loses, and she dies, and Mary wins and becomes the queen. And she wants to persecute Protestants, and she has hundreds and hundreds of Protestants killed, including burned at the stake, all kinds of crazy stuff. And that is why she is known as Bloody Mary. That's where Bloody Mary comes from. Anne of Cleves is the last, like on the timeline, the last of his 6 wives to die. She wasn't the oldest, like if you look at the ages at which they all died. I think Catherine of Aragon was much older. Eventually, Queen Mary I, she dies before she and her husband have any kids. So when she dies, the only one left to take over is Princess Elizabeth, who becomes Queen Elizabeth I. She never gets married. She becomes known as the Virgin Queen. And she is one of the greatest rulers that England ever has. she does many great things, but she's ruler for a very long time. And it's interesting because Henry didn't believe that, the line should continue through a girl. But it did. Sorry, homie. And it was Anne Boleyn's daughter. And she ended up being really amazing.